The wind in Prospect Bend carried no promises of rain. It was the tail end of a long, punishing summer, and the air tasted of copper dust and the ghosts of long-dead fires. From the porch of her small ranch house, Etta Rowan could see the black lark range saw-toothing the bruised twilight sky. The land was brittle, thirsty. Even the hardy sagebrush seemed to cringe under the relentless sun. The silver thread fork, which bordered her property, had dwindled to a shallow, listless stream. It was a land that demanded resilience, and Etta, in her late 20s with hands calloused from leather and grit permanently settled under her fingernails, had given it all she had. Her horses were her life, not just a livelihood, but the steady, breathing heart of her existence since her father had passed, leaving her the deed and a legacy of quiet determination. Tonight, the air was different, heavier. The usual chorus of crickets was subdued, and her horses were restless in the corral, their nervous stomps carrying through the dry air. Midnight, her lead stallion, a magnificent creature of jet-black muscle and fierce intelligence, let out a low, troubled whinny, trusting the animal's instinct over her own weariness. Etta left the cooling coffee on her porch rail and walked toward the stable. The scent hit her first. Not the familiar, comforting smell of hay and horse, but something sharp, chemical, and deeply wrong. Pine oil, thick and pungent. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She moved silently along the stable wall, her worn boots making no sound in the deep dust. There, a shadow detached from other shadows. A man, lean and quick, moved from post to post, sloshing liquid from a tin can. The moonlight caught the dark, viscous trail he left behind. A snake of pure menace circling the wooden structure that housed her entire future. She didn't have a firearm on her, just the cold dread that was coiling in her gut. She opened her mouth to scream, to shout, but the sound was swallowed by a sudden, violent whoosh. Flames erupted with an explosive hunger, climbing the dry timbers as if they were tinder sticks. The light was blinding, a monstrous orange blossom blooming in the heart of the night. The heat slapped her face, stealing the air from her lungs. Panic, raw and absolute, seized the horses. Their screams were a sound of pure terror, a symphony of damnation. Etta's mind went white, then cleared to a single, sharp point of focus. Midnight. He was in the first stall, the one closest to the inferno. Without a second thought, she ran to the water trough, grabbed the heavy wool blanket slung over the fence, and plunged it into the murky water. It came out sopping, impossibly heavy, wrapping it around her head and shoulders. She took a gasping breath of the cleaner air near the ground and charged into the burning stable. It was a hell of heat and smoke. The air was a thick, choking blanket of ash and burning pine. Embers rained down like malicious stars. The crackling of the fire was a deafening roar, punctuated by the splintering groans of collapsing beams. Through the swirling black smoke, she could see Midnight's eyes, white with terror, as he kicked frantically against his stall door. "Easy, boy, easy," she choked out, her voice a useless rasp. She fumbled with the heavy wooden latch, the metal already searingly hot. The smoke was a physical thing, clawing at her throat, filling her lungs with poison. Her vision swam. The world narrowed to a dizzying tunnel. Her knees buckled. This is it, she thought, a strange, detached calm settling over her. This is how it ends. Then, a shape materialized from the smoke. It was not one of her ranch hands. A man, swift and silent as a hawk, moved through the chaos as if he were born to it. He was Apache. His face, etched with a calm intensity, was the last thing she saw clearly before he scooped her into his arms. He was all hard muscle and surprising strength, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. He pressed her face into his shoulder, shielding her from the worst of the smoke, and moved toward the exit. He didn't run. He moved with a powerful, deliberate grace, navigating the falling debris and curtains of flame as they burst back into the night air. He set her on her feet, but kept a steadying hand on her arm. She coughed violently, her body retching for clean air. Through watering eyes, she looked at him, a question forming on her lips. He leaned in close, his voice low and urgent, cutting through the roar of the fire. "You want to live, do it." It wasn't a question. It was a transfer of will, a command to survive. Before she could process his words, the sharp crack of a rifle shot split the night. It wasn't a stray shot from a panicked ranch hand. It was aimed, out of the corner of her eye. Etta saw them at the edge of the firelight silhouettes on horseback. The dark blue of a cavalry coat, the unmistakable glint of a star-shaped badge on a man's chest. Sheriff Briggs Harlan. Her rescuer reacted instantly. There was no hesitation. He pulled her toward a powerful gray horse that stood untethered, waiting patiently amidst the chaos. With one fluid motion, he swung her onto its bare back and leaped up behind her. He wrapped one arm securely around her waist, grabbing a handful of mane with the other. "Hold on," he commanded. The horse surged forward. A gray arrow loosed into the darkness. They plunged away from the burning ranch, away from the gunfire, and into the winding, treacherous path of the salt cedar wash. Branches whipped at them, and the horse's hooves struck stones in the dry creek bed, sending showers of sparks into the night. More shots rang out behind them, the bullets whining past their ears or thudding into the canyon walls. They rode not with the wild panic of flight, but with a desperate, focused purpose. They didn't stop until they reached the high, wind-swept ridge of Whispering Butte. The air was cooler here, the sounds of the pursuit finally fading into the vast silence of the plains. The gray horse stood heaving, its sides slick with sweat. Below them, Etta's ranch was a dying orange eye in the immense darkness, a funeral pyre for all she had built. Soot streaked her face, her lungs burned, and her hands trembled. But inside her, a new fire was being kindled from the ashes of the old. It was a cold, hard flame of pure resolve. She looked down at the destruction, a deliberate act of violence that made no sense. And she looked at the silent Apache warrior beside her, the man who had saved her life, the man Sheriff Harlan had been trying to shoot. The pieces didn't fit, unless they were being forced into a picture she wasn't meant to see. Her voice, when she finally found it, was a raw whisper, but it carried the weight of an unbreakable oath to the listening night. "I will find them," she vowed, the words tasting of ash and promise. "I will find out who did this, and I will know why." Dawn broke not with a gentle blush, but as a raw, bleeding wound across the eastern horizon. The high desert air was thin and cold, a stark contrast to the memory of the fire. They had moved on from Whispering Butte, putting miles of broken, unforgiving terrain between them and the smoking ruin of Etta's life. Kohani led the way, his gray horse picking its path with an uncanny intelligence through the rock-strewn landscape. Etta followed, riding the horse he had freed from her corral, a sturdy buckskin mare whose initial panic had subsided into a weary, trusting plod. The silence between them was as vast and empty as the land itself. It was a silence filled with the rhythmic clopping of hooves, the creak of leather, and the whisper of the wind through skeletal junipers. Etta's mind was a maelstrom of shock, grief, and a white-hot core of anger. Questions burned in her throat, but she held them back, sensing it wasn't the time. Her rescuer was a study in contained energy, his back straight, his gaze constantly sweeping the horizon, reading the land like a language she had never learned. When the sun had climbed high enough to bake the rocks, he finally reined in his horse in the sparse shade of a granite overhang. He dismounted in a single fluid movement and came to her side, offering a leather waterskin. She reached for it, her thirst a physical ache, but he held it back for a moment. "Small sips," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. The body remembers thirst. Drink too fast, you lose it. She did as she was told, the lukewarm water a balm to her raw throat. She drank, then stopped, Handing it back, he watched her, his dark eyes unreadable, before taking a swallow himself. Only then did he speak again. Water first, questions later. They rested for a half hour, letting the horses breathe. The silence stretched, and Edda's patience frayed with it. Finally, she could hold it no longer. "Who are you?" He was checking the buckskin's hooves, his movements economical and sure. He didn't look up, a man who owes a debt. A debt to whom? To a life that was saved. He straightened up, his gaze meeting hers. There was a finality in his tone that discouraged further inquiry. He offered no name, no history, no explanation for why he was there, in that specific place, at that exact moment. He was a fact, as solid and inexplicable as the rocks around them. He spoke of no tribe, no hidden camp in a place called Stone Coyote, only of a simple, profound obligation that had placed him in the path of her fire. They continued their journey toward a distant, hazy landmark he called Copper Lantern Gulch. They followed the path of a dry wash, the sandy bottom a better surface for the horses' hooves. It was there, near a small, muddy seep where a trickle of water still surfaced, that Kohani stopped again. He slid from his horse and knelt, examining the ground. Edda dismounted and came to stand beside him. The tracks were clear in the damp earth, not the smooth, rounded impressions of an unshod Indian pony. These were sharp, well-defined crescents, with the distinct marks of nail heads. Military issue, the kind of shoes the cavalry used, the kind every rancher in the territory could identify. Sheriff Harlan's posse wore the same. They were not the tracks of a native raiding party. A cold certainty began to displace Edda's confusion. She had seen the sheriff. She had seen the blue coats. She had assumed they were chasing the man who set the fire. Now, a more sinister possibility took root in her mind. They weren't chasing the arsonist. They were his accomplices. The Apache was not the villain. He was the witness. As if sensing the turn of her thoughts, Kohani walked back to the buckskin mare. From his saddle roll, he unwrapped a piece of charred wood, a splintered section of a stall post from her stable. He drew a long, slender knife and began to dig carefully into the blackened grain. The scrape of steel on wood was the only sound. After a moment, he worked something free. He wiped it on his buckskin leggings and held it out to her on his open palm. It was a lead slug, slightly flattened from impact. It was heavy, solid. It wasn't the rough-cast ball from an old muzzle loader or the smaller caliber of a repeating rifle favored by cowboys. It was a .45, 70 cartridge, the standard ammunition for the Army's Springfield rifles, the kind of bullet that would be stored in the armory at Fort Laramie, the kind of bullet Captain Amos Dryden's men carried. The weight of the metal in her hand was the weight of proof. It was a cold, hard piece of the truth. They skirted the main trails, keeping to the low ground, as they neared an area known as Juniper Crossings, a place where several cattle trails converged. Kohani signaled for silence, pulling them into a thicket of overgrown salt cedar. He pointed. Across the clearing, two men stood by their horses, deep in conversation. One was Captain Amos Dryden, his uniform a crisp slash of blue against the dusty landscape. The other was a man whose influence was felt everywhere in Prospect Bend. A man who rarely showed his face outside the saloons and banks he controlled, Silas Corcoran, the Silver King. Edda's breath caught in her throat. Corcoran was a predator in a tailored suit, a man who bought and sold futures, land, and men with equal ruthlessness. Rumors had been swirling for months about a new vein of silver he intended to open, a massive operation that would require vast amounts of land and, more importantly, exclusive water rights, rights to the water that flowed through the Silver Thread Fork. Her land. She couldn't hear their words, but she didn't need to. She saw the smug confidence in Corcoran's posture and the deferential, almost conspiratorial nod from Captain Dryden. She saw an envelope pass from the captain's hand to Corcoran's. It was a meeting of power and greed. hidden away in the wilderness. The fire, the shod horses, the military bullet. The Apache scapegoat, it was all a brutal piece of business logic. If the small ranchers along the river could be scared off their land, their property could be acquired for pennies on the dollar. A cold fury settled over her. They weren't just trying to take her ranch. They were trying to erase her, to paint her as another casualty of a phantom menace they had invented for their own profit. Later that afternoon, as they made a cold camp in a hidden arroyo, the unspoken question of what came next hung between them. Kohani stared north, toward the jagged peaks of the mountains, a direction that promised safety and obscurity. Then he looked east, back toward the settled lands, toward Prospect Bend. He was caught between two worlds, and she was the reason. Returning her to town would be an admission of his presence, a confirmation of the lies they were already telling. Taking her with him would be to make her a permanent fugitive. Etta watched him, seeing the conflict in the tense line of his jaw. "You should leave me," she said, her voice flat. "Find a safe place. They'll be hunting you." He turned his gaze from the mountains to her. "Saving you is done," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Now, we save the truth." It was not the choice of an outlaw, but of a warrior. He was choosing the harder path, the one that led back into the fire. That evening, they shared a meal of dry, hard bread and smoked meat. The tension between them had shifted, the shared danger and the emerging truth forging a fragile, unspoken alliance. Etta, wanting to bridge the chasm of silence, pointed to the water skin. She tried to shape the Apache word she'd heard him use before. It came out clumsy, a pale imitation of the real sound. A flicker of something surprise, perhaps even amusement, crossed his face. He corrected her gently, repeating the word slowly, making her watch the shape of his mouth. She tried again. It was a small thing, a single word, but it felt like a foundation stone being laid. As darkness fell, a profound loneliness settled over the landscape. The coyotes began to sing their haunting, mournful songs from the distant mesas. Etta wrapped her singed blanket around her shoulders, the smell of smoke a constant reminder. She saw Kohani looking up at the sky, a brilliant tapestry of stars undimmed by city lights. His lips moved, but the sounds were too soft to be words, more like a whispered prayer or a recitation. She strained to listen, and slowly, she understood. He was counting, or rather, he was naming, each star, a name, a quiet, solitary ritual to remember those who were gone. It was a glimpse into the vast well of loss that lay behind his stoic silence. Etta looked down at her hands, still grimy with soot. She thought of her father, of midnight, of the life that had been stolen from her in a blast of heat and smoke. She thought of the lies spreading like poison through the territory. She would not be a footnote in Silas Corcoran's ledger. She would not be the frightened woman who ran. With deliberate movements, she took the hem of her scorched wool scarf, the one she'd used to cover her face in the stable. It was blackened and stiff. She ripped a thin strip from the edge and tied it securely around her wrist. It was a rough, ugly band against her skin. It was a promise, a vow made to herself and the silent, watching stars. She would find the truth. Her story would not be written by men like Harlan and Corcoran. She would write it herself, in ash and iron if she had to. They moved under the cover of the pre-dawn gloom, two ghosts slipping through the familiar landscape that had become enemy territory. Prospect Bend was a different town in this light. The main street, usually bustling with wagons and riders by this hour, was unnervingly still. The only sound was the lazy creak of a saloon sign swinging in the breeze. As they tethered their horses in a hidden copse of cottonwoods behind the blacksmith's forge, the first gray light of morning revealed a fresh notice pasted to the town's message board. The words were stark and black against the cheap paper land clearance. Parcels adjacent to the silver thread fork designated for future mining access road. Inquire at the Corcoran mining office. Etta felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It wasn't just a notice. It was a tombstone for the lives of her neighbors. Kohani stood beside her, his presence a silent anchor in the swirling tide of her anger. They needed an ally, a friendly ear inside the town. Etta's mind went immediately to Martha Dooley, a widow whose husband had been a close friend of her father's. Martha lived in a small cottage at the edge of town, her clothesline a landmark for all. Etta crept to the back of the general store, found a discarded burlap sack, and tied it to Martha's fence post in a specific, prearranged knot, a signal they had used as girls. It meant, "I'm here, but there's trouble." They retreated to the shadows of the abandoned livery to wait. Less than an hour later, a small boy, Martha's youngest, scurried past, accidentally dropping a folded piece of paper near the water trough. After he was gone, Kohani retrieved it. The message was scrawled in charcoal. "They've filled his ears with poison. Don't trust Sheriff Harlan." The warning confirmed what the military bullet had already told her. The law in Prospect Bend was not her shield. It was their sword. As the town slowly came to life, a crowd began to gather outside the Copper Lantern, the largest saloon and the unofficial headquarters of Silas Corcoran's operations, keeping to the alleyways. Etta and Kohani found a vantage point from a hayloft window across the street. Corcoran himself stood on the saloon's porch, dressed in a fine black suit that seemed to absorb the morning light. He wasn't shouting. His voice was calm, reasonable, a silver tongue weaving a tapestry of fear and false hope. "These are uncertain times," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "We have all heard the stories. Unprovoked attacks, ranches burned in the night by savages who resent our prosperity." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Sheriff Harlan and Captain Dryden are doing all they can to ensure our safety. But security is an expensive business. My new silver operation will not only bring prosperity, it will fund a permanent town guard. It will mean jobs. It will mean safety for your wives and children. It will mean a future for Prospect Bend, free from the shadows that haunt our borders." It was a masterful performance. He was offering them a cage and calling it a fortress. As if on cue, Captain Dryden stepped out of the sheriff's office, accompanied by Harlan. Dryden held up a freshly printed notice. He tacked it onto the message board, right next to the land clearance announcement, even from across the street. The words, drawn in thick, accusatory ink, were clear wanted. The name below it was Kohani. The crimes listed were arson, destruction of property, and the abduction of Etta Rowan. A reward was offered, a sum large enough to make a desperate man turn on his own brother. Etta felt the blood drain from her face. They had done it. They had built their monster, given him a name, and set him loose in the minds of the townspeople. They had taken her tragedy and twisted it into a weapon to use against the very people she called neighbors. The fear he was stoking would be the fire that cleared the land for his mine, and she, the victim, was now recast as a captive. Her voice silenced, her credibility destroyed. They had to move, to find something tangible to fight back with. Martha's note had included a final, cryptic line. "The deacon sees all, but says little." Deacon Weller was a quiet, bookish man who kept the records for the town's small, seldom-used church. He was also, Etta knew, a man of unshakable principle. They found him in the abandoned church at the north end of town, a dusty, hollow building that smelled of decaying paper and forgotten hymns. Sunlight streamed through a grimy stained glass window, painting the dusty air in the hues of blue and red. The deacon was a pale, thin man with ink stains on his fingers. He didn't seem surprised to see them. "I knew you would come." "Etta," he said softly, his eyes full of a troubled sympathy. "The Lord's house is a quiet place to witness the devil's work." He led them to a small office at the back, where he kept his meticulously organized ledgers. He pulled out a heavy, leather-bound book. "I am also the clerk for the Army supply shipments that pass through here," he explained, his voice barely a whisper. "Captain Dryden is a man who values process, but not always discretion." He opened the book to a page dated the day of the fire. His finger traced a line across the columns. A request for a case of .45, 70 rifle ammunition and 10 gallons of pine oil, signed out by one of Dryden's sergeants. The official reason was an target practice and stable maintenance. It was fulfilled 3 hours before your ranch was attacked. Etta stared at the neat, flowing script. It was all there, in black and white, a death warrant for her home, signed and dated. Kohani stepped forward, taking the ledger. He pulled the lead slug from his pouch and laid it on the page. His examination was swift and expert. He ran a thumb over the base of the bullet, feeling for marks. He compared its size and shape to the entry in the book. He looked at Etta, his dark eyes holding a grim certainty. The lot number stamped on the crate would match the one issued for this cartridge, he stated. It wasn't a guess. The pattern on the bullet's base, a small crosshatch from the manufacturing process, was specific to a certain batch. The paper trail and the physical evidence were now one and the same. The conspiracy was no longer a theory. It was a fact, recorded in a church ledger. But as they were solidifying their proof, their enemies were poisoning the well. By midday, a new story was slithering through the town. It started as a whisper in the saloon, a hushed comment in the general store. Etta Rowan wasn't taken. She ran off, with him. Always was a wild one. That girl, her reputation, the only currency she had left, was being systematically devalued. They were turning her from a victim into an accomplice, a traitor to her own kind. It was a vicious, effective strategy. Who would believe the woman who had willingly abandoned her home to be with an Apache fugitive? The rumors reached Sheriff Harlan's ears by late afternoon. He saw his opportunity. A public, forceful response would cement the official narrative and intimidate anyone, like Martha Dooley, who might be inclined to help. Etta and Kohani had returned to the relative safety of Martha's cottage, planning their next move, when they heard the heavy thud of boots on the porch. A sharp, commanding knock rattled the door. Martha Dooley. Open up. We have reason to believe you are harboring a fugitive and his accomplice. Harlan's voice was loud, arrogant, meant for the whole street to hear. Martha's face went pale. The back, she whispered, shoving them toward the kitchen. Go! They didn't hesitate. As Harlan's men began to batter the front door with a rifle butt, Etta and Kohani slipped out the back. They heard the splintering crash of the front door giving way just as they vaulted the low fence of the kitchen garden. They ran through the narrow space between the cottage and the neighboring building, emerging into a muddy side alley. The only escape was down, into a deep, stone-lined storm gutter that ran beneath the street. Without a word, Kohani dropped into the dark, foul-smelling channel. He reached up, and Etta took his hand, her boots slipping on the slick stones as she landed beside him. They crouched in the darkness, the sounds of the raid muffled above them shouts, the crash of overturned furniture, the frightened cries of Martha's children. They had escaped, but the net was closing. They had the truth, but no one to tell it to. Huddled in the filth and the dark, the stench of the gutter filling her nostrils, Etta felt the last of her fear burn away, leaving only a hard, cold resolve. She looked at Kohani, his face a stoic mask in the gloom. He had pulled her from a burning building, risked his life for a stranger, and now he was a wanted man because of it. She reached out and put a hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly firm. Her voice was low, but it did not tremble. It was filled with a strength she didn't know she possessed. You saved me once, she said, her eyes locking with his. Now do it. Help me save this whole town from their lies. The journey into the mountains was a climb into another world. The oppressive heat of the lowlands gave way to a sharp, clean air that tasted of pine resin and cold stone. Kohani led them along trails that were not trails at all, but faint suggestions on the landscape, a particular arrangement of rocks, the bend of a wind-scoured tree, a path visible only to one who knew the land's secret grammar. They moved through canyons of deep shadow and across ridges that offered breathtaking, terrifying views of the territory spread out below. Etta could see Prospect Bend, a tiny, insignificant cluster of buildings, a place that had been her entire world and now seemed like a bad dream. Stone Coyote Camp was not built upon the land, but woven into it, tucked into a high, bowl-shaped valley. It was sheltered by ancient ponderosa pines and granite cliffs. The lodges, made of brush and hide, were difficult to distinguish from the surrounding landscape. It was a place designed to be overlooked, a sanctuary of invisibility. As they entered the camp, activity did not cease, but its quality changed. The quiet chatter of women scraping hides, the laughter of children playing a game with pebbles, it all subsided into a low, watchful hum. Gazes followed them, sharp and questioning. Etta was acutely aware of her otherness, of her sun-faded calico dress and worn leather boots. She was the world that hunted them, brought directly into their home. At the entrance to the largest lodge, a series of unstrung arrows hung from a leather thong, their flint heads angled downward. It was not a decoration. It was a statement of readiness. A man emerged from the central lodge, his posture straight despite his age. His long hair was more silver than black, and his face was a map of seasons, etched with lines of thought and patience. This was Sachi Onyx, the elder. He did not look at Etta, not at first. His gaze rested on Kohani, a long, silent exchange passing between them. Then, his eyes, dark and deep as a mountain lake, turned to her. He did not weigh her with judgment, but with an unnerving, absolute stillness, as if trying to read the truth of her soul in the marrow of her bones. He gestured for them to enter the lodge. Inside, a small, smokeless fire burned in the center, the air cool and earthy. Several other men, warriors with hard, impassive faces, were already seated. They formed a circle, and Etta and Kohani were motioned to sit. For a long time, no one spoke. The silence was a physical weight, a test of nerve. Finally, one of the younger warriors, his face set in a permanent scowl, spoke in his native tongue, his words sharp and angry as he gestured toward Etta. He looked at Sachi Onyx, his meaning clear even without translation. Another warrior added his voice, his tone equally harsh. Kohani answered them, his voice low and steady, but Etta could hear the tension in it. He was arguing, defending his actions. The scowling warrior scoffed, spitting a word that needed no translation. Harlan. Sachi Onyx raised a hand, and the argument ceased instantly. He looked at Kohani, and then spoke to him in that same quiet tone. Kohani turned to Etta. "They want to know why I brought a white woman here," he said, his voice flat. "Tolan Flint," he nodded toward the angry warrior, "says we should return you to Harlan, that your presence here brings the hornet's nest to our door. He argues that trading you might buy us peace." The cold, pragmatic cruelty of it struck Etta, but she couldn't even find it in herself to be angry. From their perspective, it was a logical, even necessary, calculation. One life to save 50. She looked at the faces around the fire faces of men who had been pushed, hunted, and betrayed for generations. Why should they believe her? Why should they risk everything for her? This was her moment. Her voice, if she had one, had to be used now. She stood, a gesture of respect, her legs trembling slightly. She met the elder's gaze. "I cannot ask for your trust," she began, her voice hoarse but clear, "because my people have broken it 1,000 times. The world I come from is filled with men who speak with forked tongues, who make promises with one hand and carry a weapon in the other." She paused, taking a breath. "I used to believe some of their stories. I used to look at the mountains and feel fear, because that is what I was taught to feel. I was wrong." She reached into the small pouch at her belt and took out the lead slug Kohani had dug from her stable wall. She stepped forward and placed it on a flat stone near the fire. "This is a soldier's bullet," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It was fired from a cavalry rifle. On the same day, Captain Dryden signed out ammunition from the supply clerk in town. I saw him myself, speaking in secret with Silas Corcoran, the man who wants the water from my land for his silver mine. They burned my home, and they created a story that you were to blame. They have put my name on a wanted poster next to Kohani's, calling me his captive. They are not just hunting him, they are hunting the truth. She looked directly at Tolan Flint. Giving me to Sheriff Harlan will not buy you peace. It will buy them a witness who they can silence forever. It will give them the proof they need to tell the world their lie is true. It will be the excuse they need to come here and destroy everything you have, just as they destroyed my home. She returned to her spot and sat. She had offered them the only thing she had: the unvarnished facts and an admission of her own past ignorance. The lodge was silent again. But the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer just hostile. It was contemplative. Sachi Onyx picked up the bullet, turning it over in his weathered fingers. He looked at Etta for a long moment, then spoke a single, quiet word to Kohani. "He believes you," Kohani translated, a hint of relief in his voice. The elder then spoke again, a longer, more measured statement. Kohani listened, then turned to Etta. "He says a truth is like a river. It can be dammed for a time, but it will always find its way through, and that a person who admits they were blind can sometimes see more clearly than those who have always had sight." Sachi Onyx then motioned for a woman to bring a simple, unadorned clay bowl filled with water. He held it out, first to Kohani, who drank from it. Then he offered it to Etta. She took the heavy bowl in both hands, the clay cool against her skin, and drank. The water was cold and pure. It was a simple gesture, but it resonated with a profound significance. It was an acceptance, a pact. "This is a promise of protection," Kohani explained softly as she handed the bowl back. "It is not a bond of marriage, but a pledge that you are under the camp's care. While you are here, your life is as our life." The days that followed were an education. The initial suspicion of the camp's inhabitants slowly thawed into a cautious, reserved acceptance. The women, in particular, took her under their wing. An older woman with kind eyes and knowing hands named Elise showed her how to strip the long, tough fibers from yucca leaves and roll them against her thigh to create strong cordage. Another taught her how to scrape the inner bark of the ponderosa pine, which, when boiled, made a potent medicine for coughs and cleaning wounds. It was a life of constant, purposeful work, a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. One afternoon, a small boy ran past her, crying silently as he clutched his hand. He had stumbled into a patch of thorns. Without thinking, Etta knelt and gently took his hand. She spoke to him in a soft, soothing tone as she expertly removed the thorn and, using a strip of clean cloth and some of the pine medicine she had helped prepare, bandaged his small finger. The boy's mother watched from a distance, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. Etta was no longer just the outsider. She was a contributing part of the camp's delicate ecosystem. The fragile peace was shattered a week later when a scout returned, his horse lathered and his face grim. He spoke urgently to Sachi Onyx, and a council was immediately called. The news was dire. Captain Dryden, frustrated by his inability to locate Kohani, was planning a more direct approach. The scout had overheard two soldiers talking in Prospect Bend. The plan was to stage an attack on a freight wagon, kill the drivers, and leave Apache arrows at the scene. It would be manufactured as a brutal massacre. The final justification: Dryden needed to launch a full-scale, punitive expedition against Stone Coyote Camp, an expedition from which no one was meant to return. The mood in the council lodge was grim. Tolan Flint was on his feet instantly, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He argued for a preemptive strike, for meeting violence with greater violence. "We should hit their supply lines," he urged. "Make them bleed before they can make us bleed." Kohani, to Etta's surprise, did not immediately disagree. "A show of force might make them hesitate," he argued, his gaze on the elder. "If they know we are not sheep to be slaughtered, they may think twice." But Sachi Onyx shook his head slowly. "They want us to fight," he said, his voice carrying an ancient weight. "They are trying to bait a bear out of its cave. If we attack, we become the monsters in their story. We give their lie the teeth it needs to bite. No, we will not fight them on their terms." He looked around the circle, his eyes resting on each warrior. "Their plan is built on a shadow. We will fight it with light. Their weapon is a lie. Ours must be the truth. We must be bright as water, so all can see the rocks that lie beneath." He turned to Edda. "We must find a way to show the people of the town what is happening, before the first shot is even fired." Their path was chosen. They would not meet deception with violence, but with exposure. In the days that followed, the camp shifted from quiet survival to focused preparation. Edda retrieved the one thing she had managed to save from her life before the fire, an item Kohani had rescued from her saddlebag, her father's old Winchester rifle. It was heavy and familiar in her hands. She spent hours at the edge of the valley, practicing. At first, her hands trembled, the memory of the fire and the gunshots making her flinch. But with each shot, a little more of the fear was replaced by a cold, steady purpose. Kohani coached her, not on aggression, but on breath and stillness. Her aim grew truer with every sunrise. Together, she and Kohani began to draw a map in the dirt, pooling their knowledge. She knew the layout of the ranches, the roads, the locations of old, forgotten line shacks. He knew the hidden canyons, the game trails, the secret ways through the mountains that appeared on no white man's map. Their target was Ash Vale Hollow, a secluded box canyon where, according to the scout, Corcoran's men were already doing preliminary work, illegally transferring ore samples under the cover of night. If they could get proof of Corcoran's operation, proof that it had started long before he had any legal claim to the land, they could expose the entire conspiracy. It was during one of these planning sessions that the tension between Kohani and Tolan Flint finally boiled over. Tolan watched them, his arms crossed, his face a mask of resentment. "You put too much faith in the white woman's plans," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "And in her rifle shoots as straight as any other." Kohani replied without looking up from the map. "It is not her aim I question. It is her blood," Tolan shot back. "You forget who you are. Kohani, you forget who Sheriff Harlan is." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a raw, personal whisper. "I do not. I remember the day he and his men rode through my uncle's camp. They called it keeping the peace. I call it murder. A bullet from a rifle like hers is what killed my cousin." The truth of his animosity was suddenly laid bare. It wasn't just strategic disagreement. It was a deep, unhealed wound. His hatred for Harlan was so profound that he couldn't separate Edda from the man who hunted them both. This internal division, this seed of old bitterness, was a threat as dangerous as any soldier under Dryden's command. Edda looked from Tolan's furious eyes to Kohani's impassive face and realized their fight was not just against Silas Corcoran's greed, but against the ghosts of 100 other betrayals, ghosts that threatened to tear them apart from within. The wind rose first, a low, mournful sigh from the south, carrying with it the fine, red dust of the distant flats. It was a warning. Kohani tasted the air, his eyes narrowed on the horizon. A bruised yellow-gray bank of cloud was building there. Not a rain cloud, but something dirtier, angrier. "They're coming," he said, his voice quiet. "And so is the storm." The plan had been to observe, to gather more proof from Ash Vale Hollow. But the scout's report changed everything. Harlan was on the move. He wasn't leading a posse to enforce the law. He was leading a hunting party. They weren't riding to the mountains. They were converging on Juniper Crossings, the very place Edda had seen Dryden and Corcoran make their deal. They were sweeping the area, not just for a fight, but for a pawn. Harlan's strategy was chillingly clear. He didn't necessarily want Kohani dead. He wanted a live captive, an Apache warrior he could drag back to Prospect Bend, break in a cell, and parade before the town as the confessed arsonist. He needed a living symbol for their lie. There was no time to retreat. They were caught. The only way out was through. "He's trying to flush us out," Etta said, her knuckles white on the stock of her father's Winchester. "He will," Kohani replied, "but not the way he expects." They split up. It was a desperate gamble, a plan sketched in haste in the lee of a rock. Kohani, along with Tolan Flint and 2 other warriors, would draw the main party west, into the maze of arroyos and canyons. They would be the bait, a flicker of movement to pull the wolf pack in. Etta's role was different. She was the ghost, the echo. She took her horse and rode hard for the Silver Thread Fork, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. In her pocket was a small, flat tin whistle her father had made for her as a child, capable of producing a piercingly high note. The plan was to create a diversion, a false signal to splinter Harlan's focus. She reached the riverbank just as the first riders appeared on the far ridge, dark silhouettes against the churning, dust-choked sky. She could make out Harlan's bulky frame in the lead. They were moving deliberately, spreading out, a living net being cast across the land. The wind was a physical force now, whipping her hair across her face, stinging her eyes with sand. The world was losing its sharp edges, dissolving into a gritty, ochre haze. She raised the whistle to her lips, took a breath, and blew. The sound was thin, but it was sharp, cutting through the rising howl of the wind. A clear, 3-note call, the signal for a flanking maneuver. She saw heads turn on the ridge, a hand point in her direction. It worked. Harlan had to assume he was being pincered, that a second war party was closing in from the east. He dispatched 6 riders to investigate, weakening his main force. Then the storm hit. It was not a gradual event. It was a wall. One moment, she could see the riders. The next, the world was gone, replaced by a screaming, blinding maelstrom of sand. Visibility dropped to nothing. The sun was extinguished. The sky fell. The roar was absolute, a deafening abrasion that scoured all other sounds from existence. Etta pulled her scarf up over her nose and mouth, tasting grit. Her horse whinnied in terror, turning its back to the onslaught. She could do nothing but hold on, trust the animal's instinct, and pray. Inside the storm, chaos reigned. The cavalry riders, separated from their commander and each other, were blind. They called out, but the wind tore the words from their mouths. Panic set in. A spooked horse collided with another. A nervous trooper saw a shape move in the swirling dust and fired. The muzzle flash was a brief, terrifying star in the gloom. Another rider, thinking he was under attack, returned fire in moments. Harlan's disciplined posse had devolved into a terrified, circular firing squad, shooting at their own shadows. Etta couldn't see any of this, but she had planned for it. Before the storm hit, she had located her target, a lone supply wagon lumbering behind the main party. She had galloped in a wide, fast circle, using her knowledge of the terrain. Tucked into a narrow cut between 2 low hills was a thick rope she and Kohani had anchored to a high rock earlier. The other end was tied around a precariously balanced cluster of heavy, loose rocks directly above the trail. She dismounted, her eyes streaming, and felt her way to the rope. She could hear the creak and groan of the wagon approaching, the driver cursing the storm. She waited, counting the seconds, judging the distance by sound alone. Now, she pulled with all her weight. The rocks tumbled, a miniature avalanche of granite and dust. They didn't hit the driver, but they slammed into the side of the wagon with a splintering crash. A barrel, improperly secured, tipped and shattered on the ground. Oil lamp oil, thick and viscous, gushed out, soaking the ground. The wagon lurched to a halt, its axle broken, its vital supplies lost. The chain of command was broken. Now their logistics were too... Etta scrambled back to her horse, a phantom in the gale. Her part was done. Now she had to find Kohani. She rode on instinct, heading west, letting the horse guide her through the suffocating chaos. The storm was a living thing, a furious beast trying to unmake the world. Then, through the roar, she heard a sound that didn't belong. The sharp, metallic ring of steel on steel. She urged her horse forward, drawn to the sound. Two figures emerged from the swirling dust, locked in a desperate struggle. Kohani and Tolan Flint, but they were not fighting side by side. They were fighting each other. Tolan, his face a mask of pure rage, had a knife in his hand. He had seen his chance in the chaos, a moment to settle his old score, to eliminate the man he saw as a rival, the man who trusted a white woman. Kohani was unarmed, using his speed and skill to deflect Tolan's furious lunges. But he was on the defensive, and Tolan was relentless. Edda didn't think. She reacted. The Winchester was in her hands. The horse was skittish, the wind a solid wall. An impossible shot. She raised the rifle, tried to brace her arm, find a moment of stillness in the heart of the storm. Tolan lunged again, the knife arcing toward Kohani's back. Edda fired. The explosion of the rifle was swallowed by the wind, but the result was immediate. The knife flew from Tolan's hand, spinning end over end into the dust, the bullet having struck the hilt with a violent clang. Tolan stared at his empty, stinging hand, then at Edda, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. Kohani used the moment of hesitation, not to attack Tolan, but to shove him away. "The enemy is there!" he yelled, pointing into the storm, where the sounds of confused gunfire still echoed. "Not here." Just then, another shape stumbled out of the dust, a cavalry trooper, leading his horse. On the horse's saddle was a heavy leather mail pouch. The courier, separated from the main group. Lost, he saw the three of them, his eyes wide with fear. He fumbled for his pistol. Kohani moved like lightning. He closed the distance in 2 strides, disarming the man with a swift, brutal efficiency. He grabbed the mail pouch, slinging it over his shoulder. He looked at Edda, 1,000 words passing between them in a single glance. "Go." Edda wheeled her horse around, and Kohani swung up behind her. He took the reins in one hand, holding the precious pouch with the other. They galloped into the heart of the storm, leaving Tolan standing alone in the wind. A warrior caught between his hatred and the woman who had just saved the man he meant to kill. Suddenly, a figure burst through the curtain of sand. Riding hard, Sheriff Briggs Harlan. He had seen the muzzle flash, heard the rifle shot that was not one of his own. He saw Edda and Kohani on the same horse, the mail pouch in their possession. "Halt!" he roared, his voice nearly lost in the wind. He raised his revolver and fired. The bullet tore through the fabric of Edda's sleeve, a hot breath against her skin. They were in open country now, a flat, featureless mesa. Nowhere to hide. Harlan was a relentless pursuer, his bigger horse gaining on them. Another shot. This one kicked up dust just behind their horses' hooves. They were running out of time, running out of land. The edge of Hollow Mesa was rushing toward them, a sheer drop into the canyon below. A dead end. "To the left," Kohani yelled in her ear. "There is a gap." Edda saw it. A sliver of an opening, a narrow crack in the canyon wall barely wide enough for a single horse. But it was too far. They would never make the turn in time. Harlan was closing too fast. They were 10 yards from the cliff edge. 5. "Trust me," Kohani said, his voice a low, urgent command against her ear. "Do it." Then he did the impossible. As Edda galloped parallel to the cliff edge, Kohani released the reins. He launched himself off the back of the horse, landing with cat-like agility on a narrow ledge of rock just below the rim. In the same motion, as Edda's horse thundered past, he reached out, wrapped an arm around her waist, and pulled. For a heart-stopping moment, she was suspended between the horse and the canyon, the world a blur of motion and wind. Then she was free of the saddle, pulled into the narrow crevice with him. Their momentum sent them tumbling. They rolled down a steep, soft slope of sand that had collected in the fissure, landing in a heap at the bottom. Their horse, riderless, veered away from the cliff edge at the last second. Above them, on the rim, Harlan's horse skidded to a halt, showering them with pebbles. For a moment, there was a strange, sudden silence. The wind howled above, but down in the crevice, they were sheltered. The world was muffled. Still, the storm was somewhere else. Harlan stood at the edge, a dark, furious silhouette against the raging, dusty sky. He couldn't get a clean shot. He couldn't follow. He raised his fist to the heavens, and his voice, filled with impotent rage, echoed down into the canyon, a sound even the storm could not swallow. "I'll see you all hang," he screamed, his words a damning confession. "I will cleanse this whole damn river valley. I'll burn you out, all of you." The wind carried his promise away. Edda lay on the soft sand, her body bruised, her lungs heaving. Kohani knelt beside her, his hand still holding the military mail pouch. It was heavy, solid. It was the truth. She looked at it, then up at the sky. The fire she felt inside her was no longer the desperate, panicked heat of a victim. It was a cold, bright, purifying flame. It wasn't burning for a lost stable or a dead horse. It was burning away all the fear, all the hesitation, all the cowardice in the world that allowed men like Harlan to thrive. And she would use it to light up the dark. The storm broke the world. The howling, scouring wind of the sandstorm was replaced by a sound that was at once more violent and more cleansing. The first clap of thunder was not a sound but a physical blow, a concussive force that vibrated through the rock of the canyon, shaking the very bones in their bodies. Then came the rain. Not a gentle spring shower, but a deluge, a solid sheet of cold water that turned the air to a gray, roaring curtain. They were soaked in an instant, the water plastering their clothes to their skin, washing away the layers of red dust and grime. The narrow fissure that had been their sanctuary was quickly becoming a channel for a new, fast-moving stream. They had to move. Kohani, without a word, took Edda's hand, his grip firm and reassuring. He led her deeper into the crack in the mesa, which soon opened into a shallow, protected overhang, a dark mouth in the cliff face that promised shelter from the worst of the storm. They stumbled inside, shivering, into a space that smelled of damp stone and ancient dust. The fury of the storm was now a muffled roar outside. Here, in the belly of the rock, there was a profound, almost sacred stillness. Edda sank to the ground, her body finally admitting to its exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the chase and the fall was gone, leaving behind a deep, aching weariness. Kohani was not still. He moved with a quiet purpose, gathering a few pieces of dry, hardy brush that had blown into the back of the small cave. With a flint and steel from his pouch, he coaxed a tiny, hesitant flame to life. It was a fragile thing, a spark of defiance against the cold and the dark. He fed it patiently, and slowly, it grew, pushing back the shadows, casting a warm, flickering light on their faces. It was in that unsteady golden light that she saw it. His left shoulder was darker than the rest of his buckskin shirt, a wet, dark patch that wasn't just from the rain. "You're hurt," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. He glanced down, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face, as if the injury were a trivial inconvenience. "A scratch." "Harlan's shot," she stated. It wasn't a question. She had felt the bullet tear past her, and now she knew how close it had come. "Let me see." He hesitated for a moment, then relented, his pride giving way to the quiet authority in her voice. He pulled the wet buckskin shirt over his head, his movements stiff. The firelight played across the hard, lean muscles of his back and chest. The wound was a long, angry furrow across the top of his shoulder, the skin plowed open by the bullet's passage. It was bleeding sluggishly, a wound that would fester if not cleaned and closed. Edda's training as a rancher took over. She had stitched up more than one horse and a few careless ranch hands in her time. She moved closer to the fire, tearing a long strip from the hem of her petticoat, the last clean piece of cloth she owned. She dipped it in the water from her canteen and gently, carefully, began to clean the wound. He sat perfectly still, his back to her, not flinching as she worked, but she could feel the tension in his shoulders, the tightly controlled breath he took as she cleaned the grit from the raw flesh. The space between them shrank until it was nothing. The world outside, with its thunder and its rain, faded away, replaced by the small, intimate circle of firelight. "It needs stitches," she said, her voice low. He nodded, reaching for his pouch. He handed her a small, rolled piece of leather. Inside was a curved needle and a coil of fine, strong linen thread. Her hands, which had been so steady a moment ago, began to tremble. This was not a horse. This was not a stranger. This was the man who had pulled her from the fire, the man whose life was now inextricably bound to her own. She knelt before him, facing him now, so she could see his face as she worked. He met her gaze, his own eyes dark and unreadable in the flickering light. To get the right angle for the first stitch, she had to lean in close, so close that her forehead was almost touching his. She could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, see the small, tense muscle twitching in his jaw. She took a breath, trying to still the tremor in her fingers, and pushed the needle through his skin. He took a sharp, quiet breath, but did not move. She worked in silence, her focus narrowed to the needle, the thread, the slow, painful process of pulling his torn skin back together. Each stitch was a tiny act of repair, a small victory against the violence that had been done to him. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the steady drumming of the rain on the rock above, and the soft sound of their breathing, almost in unison. When she was finished, she tied off the thread and gently wiped a last bead of blood from his shoulder. Her hand lingered for a moment on his warm skin. She didn't pull away. He didn't move. They stayed there, frozen in that moment of near contact, the air thick with unspoken words. It was Etta who finally broke the silence. Her voice was barely audible above the storm, a confession wrung from the deepest part of her exhausted soul. "I'm scared," she whispered, her eyes locked on his. She saw a question form in them, and she answered it before he could ask. Not of the bullets, not of Harlan, or the storm. She took a shaky breath. "I'm scared that I'll wake up tomorrow morning, and you won't be here." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. It was the truth, starker and more terrifying than any conspiracy. The fear of losing this silent, stoic man who had become her only anchor in a world that had come undone. A look of profound surprise softened the hard lines of his face. He seemed to search for words, a rare uncertainty in his eyes. Then he spoke, not in English, but in the low, guttural music of his own tongue. The words were soft, like a prayer or a promise. He saw the incomprehension in her face and leaned closer still, until their foreheads finally, gently, touched. The contact was electric, a current of warmth that spread through her entire body. He translated, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. "Chai libiati," he whispered. "Split water still quenches a fire." He paused, letting the metaphors settle in the space between them. "It means we live on together." It was not a declaration of love, but it was something more fundamental, more powerful. It was a statement of shared existence, a promise of a unified path forward. It was everything. The last of Etta's defenses crumbled. The hesitation that had held them apart vanished. She closed the final inch between them, and he met her halfway. He didn't kiss her. He simply held her. His arms went around her, pulling her into an embrace that was not gentle, but fierce, desperate, a holding on against the storm both outside and within. She pressed her face into the curve of his uninjured shoulder, her own arms wrapping around his strong back, and held on just as tightly. It was an embrace of equals, of two survivors finding a single point of stillness in a spinning world. His breath was warm against her hair, and it mingled with her own, smelling of the rain and the pine-scented smoke from the small fire. After a long moment, she eased back slightly, just enough to look at him. She reached for the heavy leather mail pouch, which lay on the ground beside them. She picked it up and placed it deliberately on the flat stone between them, between his knee and hers. "The truth," she said, her voice stronger now, steadier. "It's between us. It's what holds us together." He looked at the pouch, then back at her, and gave a slow, solemn nod. He understood. Their bond wasn't just born of circumstance or a fleeting moment of comfort. It was forged in their shared purpose, founded on the dangerous, heavy truth contained within that leather bag. He reached out and gently brushed a stray, damp strand of hair from her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly soft against her skin. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the cave walls. Outside, the rain began to fall even harder, a relentless, percussive rhythm that seemed to be washing the world clean. The small, warm fire at their feet hissed as a stray drop of water found it, but it did not go out. It held its ground, burning brighter. The scene softened, the sharp edges blurring. The camera of the mind pulled back, leaving the two figures silhouetted against the growing warmth of the fire. The sound of their breathing lost in the greater sound of the falling rain. The darkness at the edges of the firelight crept in, a soft, final curtain, a fade to black, leaving only the sound of a steady, shared heartbeat and the promise of a quiet, warm peace. Morning came not with a jolt, but with a slow, gentle return to the world. The storm had passed. A cool, clean light filtered into the cave, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and damp sage. The first thing Etta was aware of was the warmth. The second was the weight. Sometime during the night, they had shifted, and she was now lying with her head on his good shoulder, their bodies curled together for warmth. His arm was still around her, and her hand was resting on his chest. Their fingers were intertwined, a comfortable, natural fit. She lay still, not wanting to break the spell. There were no grand vows spoken in the night, no flowery promises. There didn't need to be. Everything that needed to be said had been conveyed in a shared look, in the simple, profound act of holding on through the storm. They had stepped across a threshold, and there was no going back. She must have stirred, because his breathing changed. He was awake. He didn't move, but she felt the slight tensing of his muscles as he became aware of their position. Slowly, she lifted her head. He looked at her, his eyes clear and calm in the morning light. There was no awkwardness, no regret, only a quiet, steady acceptance. He sat up, and without a word, he took a thin, soft strip of braided leather from his pouch. He took her right hand, the one that still wore the ugly, scorched band of cloth she had tied there as a promise to herself. He gently unwrapped the charred fabric, letting it fall to the cave floor. Then, he took the new leather thong and tied it carefully around her wrist. It was a simple, single loop, but it was tied with a knot she didn't recognize, a knot that was both beautiful and strong. It was not a ring. It was not a brand of ownership. It was a sign, a marker, a symbol of protection, given freely. It was a promise heavier than any spoken word. She looked down at the soft leather against her skin, then back up at him. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine, hopeful smile she had felt in what seemed like a lifetime. "You saved me," she said, her voice soft but filled with a new, unshakable strength. She reached out and placed her hand on the mail pouch that still lay between them. "Now do it again. Help me save this truth." The sun beat down on the Prospect Bend Market Square, turning the dust to a fine, shimmering powder. It was market day. The one day of the week the town felt like a real community, a bustling hub of commerce and gossip. Farmers sold produce from the backs of their wagons. Ranchers haggled over livestock, and the air was thick with the smell of canvas, leather, and fried bread. It was into this scene of noisy, mundane life that Etta Rowan walked, emerging from the alleyway beside the general store like an apparition from a ghost story. She was not the wild-eyed, disheveled captive the wanted posters described. Her dress was torn and stained, her face smudged with dirt, but she walked with a straight-backed, unwavering purpose. Under one arm, she clutched the heavy military mail pouch. She didn't stop, didn't speak to anyone. She walked directly to the center of the square, climbed onto the back of an empty flatbed wagon that served as an impromptu stage, and turned to face the crowd. A hush fell over the market. Conversations died. Faces turned. The woman they had been told was abducted, the woman they had been whispering about for days, was standing before them, not in chains, but by her own free will. Sheriff Briggs Harlan, who had been holding court near the saloon, pushed his way through the crowd, his face a thundercloud of fury and surprise. Captain Dryden was right behind him, his military bearing rigid with shock. "Etta Rowan," Harlan boomed, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "You are in a great deal of trouble. We're taking you into protective custody." Etta looked down at him, her expression unreadable. "I'm not the one in trouble." "Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and carrying across the silent square. "And I'm not here for your protection. I'm here to request a town meeting. Right now, in the granary hall. There's a story you've all been told, and I'm here to tell you the truth." A murmur went through the crowd. This was better than any market day gossip. This was a reckoning. Before Harlan could object, the tide of public opinion had already turned. People started moving toward the cavernous grain storage hall, their curiosity overriding the sheriff's authority, cornered. Harlan had no choice but to follow. A grim, predatory smile fixed on his face. He would let her have her stage. Then he would destroy her on it. The granary hall was hot and smelled of dust and old grain. The entire town seemed to have crammed inside, their faces upturned and expectant. Etta stood on the loading platform at one end, the mail pouch at her feet. Harlan, Dryden, and a smug-looking Silas Corcoran stood to one side, a united front of power and intimidation. "We have a witness," Harlan began, seizing control of the proceedings. "A man who saw what happened that night, Jedediah. Step forward." A grimy, nervous-looking man was shoved forward from the crowd. He twisted a ragged hat in his hands, refusing to meet Etta's gaze. "Tell them what you saw. Jedediah," Harlan prompted, his voice oozing false sympathy. I was checking my trap lines," the man mumbled, his eyes on the floor. "I saw him, the Apache. Saw him clear as day. Splashing that oil, lit the match himself." A wave of angry muttering swept through the hall. It was confirmation of their deepest fears. Etta waited for the noise to subside. Then she spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. "Jedediah, did you happen to see what kind of bullets the sheriff's men were firing that night?" The man looked confused. "Bullets, no, ma'am, just the fire." "That's a shame," Etta said, her voice turning to ice, "because the bullets tell a different story." She reached into the pouch and pulled out the heavy supply ledger she had taken from Deacon Weller's church. She held it up. "This is the Army supply ledger, kept by Deacon Weller. It shows that on the afternoon before my ranch burned, Captain Dryden's sergeant signed out a case of .45, 70 rifle ammunition, and 10 gallons of pine oil." All eyes turned to Captain Dryden, whose face had gone pale. "That's a lie," Dryden snapped. "That ledger could be forged." "Is it?" Deacon Etta asked, her eyes finding the churchman in the crowd. Deacon Weller, looking terrified but resolute, stepped forward. "The ledger is authentic," he said, his voice trembling but clear. "The signature is Captain Dryden's. I witnessed it myself." Etta then reached back into the pouch and pulled out another document. "And this is a military order. which I believe is also in your handwriting. Captain, it's an order for the compulsory relocation of all settlers along the Silver Thread Fork, citing escalating native hostilities. She held it up for all to see. The interesting thing about this order is the date. It was signed and dated 2 full days before my ranch was burned down. It seems you already knew there would be odd hostilities before they even happened. The crowd was silent now, a stunned, disbelieving silence. The pieces were starting to connect in their minds, forming a picture that was ugly and deeply unsettling. And about those bullets, Etta continued, her gaze sweeping the room. I have one here, one that Kohani, the man you call a monster, dug from the wall of my burning stable. She held up the slug. Ivor Kett, you're the blacksmith. You've shoed more cavalry horses than anyone. Tell the town if this is the kind of bullet an Apache would use. Ivor Kett, a mountain of a man with soot permanently etched into his skin, lumbered forward. He took the bullet, turned it over in his massive hands, and squinted. No, ma'am, he rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. This here is military issue. Got the arsenal stamp on the base. Ain't no Apache I ever heard of casts his own lead with a government stamp on it. The foundation of Harlan's story was crumbling. Before he could respond, another voice rose from the crowd. It was Martha Dooley. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a righteous fury. They're liars, she cried, pointing a trembling finger at Silas Corcoran. His men came to my home a month ago. They offered me $50 for my land. $50. They said if I didn't take it, things might get difficult. They said the valley was becoming an unsafe place for a widow to be on her own. A ripple of recognition went through the hall. Others began to murmur their own stories. A low offer, a veiled threat, a warning about coming troubles. The pattern was undeniable. All eyes now settled on Silas Corcoran, who stood with a look of bored indifference, as if he were listening to the buzzing of a fly. Captain Dryden, however, had reached his limit. His military authority, his very honor, was being dismantled before a crowd of dusty ranchers. This is a farce, he bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. This woman is a known sympathizer to a wanted fugitive. She is an accomplice. Sheriff, I order you to arrest her for harboring an enemy of the peace. Etta didn't flinch. She looked directly at Dryden, her eyes blazing, then read the order out loud. Captain, she challenged, her voice ringing through the hall. Read the date you signed it. Read it for everyone to hear. Tell them how you condemned us all before a single crime had even been committed. Dryden stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He was trapped by his own paperwork. And in that moment of stunned silence, the main doors of the granary hall swung open. A figure stood silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. It was Kohani. He was unarmed. His hands were empty and open at his sides. He wore no war paint, only the simple buckskin leggings and shirt he had worn in the mountains. Around his wrist, clearly visible to everyone, was the twin to the braided leather thong that Etta wore. He walked slowly, deliberately, into the center of the hall. A wave of fear and hatred washed over the room. Murderer, someone shouted. Savage, cried another. The insults rained down on him, but he did not react. He walked until he stood beside Etta on the platform, a silent, unmovable presence. He stood straight, his gaze sweeping over the hostile faces, meeting their hatred with a calm, quiet dignity that seemed to rob their words of their power. He looked at the crowd, and when he finally spoke, his voice was not the guttural growl they expected. It was low, clear, and steady. I pulled this woman from the fire that you blame me for, he said, his words simple, direct, and devastating. A fire that was set to make you afraid. You have been listening to the story of the wolf. Now, you must listen to the story of the lamb. Just as Harlan was about to order his men to seize him, a small voice piped up from the front of the crowd. It was Martha Dooley's young son, the boy who had delivered the note. He was holding something up in his hand. I found this, he said, his voice small but clear. Out by the edge of the woods. near the Rowan place. I thought it was pretty." He stepped forward and handed the object to Etta. It was another bullet, identical to the one Ivor Kett had examined, but this one hadn't been fired. It was a complete cartridge, dropped and lost in the grass. And stamped clearly on its base was not just the arsenal mark, but the lot number. Deacon Weller pushed his spectacles up his nose and peered at the cartridge, then at his ledger. His eyes went wide. "It's a match," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. "The lot number on the cartridge. It's the same as the one assigned to the crate of ammunition the captain signed for." The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. It was a closed circuit. The proof was absolute, irrefutable, and it had been delivered by the hand of a child. Silas Corcoran finally moved. He saw the tide had turned, that his pawns had been exposed, but men like Corcoran always had one last move. He stepped forward, ignoring the angry glares of the townspeople, and addressed Etta directly, his voice a smooth, reasonable balm. "This has all been a terrible misunderstanding. My dear," he said, a reptilian smile playing on his lips. "Clearly, some of my associates have been overzealous. There is no need for this public unpleasantness. My offer for your land still stands. In fact, out of respect for your recent troubles, I am prepared to triple it. We can settle this right now, quietly." He was offering to buy her silence, to let the whole rotten conspiracy be swept under the rug in exchange for a bag of silver. It was the ultimate expression of his contempt for her, for all of them. Etta looked at the moneylender, at the man who had burned her life to the ground for profit, and she felt a wave of cold, clean power. She was no longer just a victim. She was the agent of this town's awakening. "My land is not for sale. Mr. Corcoran," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. "And neither is this town's future." She turned to the assembled ranchers and farmers. "Her people. He wants to buy my silence. But what he's really trying to buy is your water, your homes, your children's inheritance. I say we put it to a vote, under the town charter, to seize the mining claim and place it under the protection of a community trust." A roar of approval went up from the crowd. They had been manipulated, lied to, and nearly cheated out of their homes. They were angry, and now they were united. It was too much for Briggs Harlan. His authority was gone. His conspiracy was exposed. His world was collapsing around him, with a snarl of pure, animalistic rage. He drew his revolver. He didn't aim at Etta or Kohani. He aimed at the ceiling and fired. The bullet ripped through the air and shattered the large oil lamp hanging from the central beam. Glass exploded, and flaming oil rained down. Chaos erupted. People screamed and shoved, trying to escape the spreading flames and the madman with the gun. The town meeting had become a riot. The townsfolk, who moments ago had been a jury, were now a mob, and they finally, truly, understood that they had been betrayed. The chaos of the granary hall did not end in the square. It spilled out into the high country. It was a desperate, ragged retreat, not of an army, but of a people awakened. Etta, Kohani, and a small, determined band of ranchers and townsfolk, including Martha Dooley and a surprisingly resolute Deacon Weller, fell back to the one place that offered a natural defense, Echo Gash Canyon. It was a jagged wound in the earth, a place of treacherous footing and strange, warped acoustics, where a whisper could become a shout and a shout could become a confusing, disembodied roar. They knew Captain Dryden would not simply let them go. His career, his very freedom, now depended on silencing them permanently. He gathered the last of his loyal troopers, men too disciplined or too dim to question his descent into madness, and a handful of Silas Corcoran's hired guns. They rode from Prospect Bend not as peacekeepers, but as an extermination squad. Their objective was simple: ride into Echo Gash and leave no one alive to tell the story. As the column of riders entered the narrow mouth of the canyon, the world changed. The open sky was replaced by towering walls of red rock that seemed to lean in, pressing down on them. The clatter of their horses' hooves, a confident, rhythmic sound on the open plain, became a discordant, clattering din. An order shouted by an officer at the front of the column reached the men at the back as a garbled, delayed slur of sound, as if the very air were drunk. High above them, hidden in a rockfall that offered a perfect view of the canyon floor, Kohani watched them advance. He held a small, elegantly carved flute made from the bone of a deer. It was not an instrument of peace. He put it to his lips and played a short, sharp, bird-like call. The note shot out across the canyon, struck the far wall, and bounced back. Seemingly from a different location, he played again, a different note, a different rhythm. It echoed from a third spot. To the confused troopers below, it sounded as if they were riding into a perfectly orchestrated ambush, with signalers perched on every ledge. Dryden, enraged, yelled, "Advance! It's a trick forward." His command caromed off the rock walls. "Advance! A trick! Forward! Ward! Ard!" The overlapping echoes turned a simple order into a stuttering, chaotic mess. The troopers looked at each other, their confidence beginning to fray. They were fighting not just an enemy, but the canyon itself. Further down the canyon, Etta was organizing her own brand of defense. Her troops were not warriors. They were men like Ivor Kett, the blacksmith, whose strength was for the forge, not the battlefield, and farmers whose hands were shaped for the plow, not the rifle. She didn't ask them to fight. She asked them to work. "Here," she commanded, pointing to a narrow section of the canyon floor littered with loose scree. "We don't have to stop them. We just have to stop their horses." Under her direction, they became a frantic work crew. They rolled large boulders into the path, creating a crude but effective barricade. They hauled barrels of sand, salvaged from a nearby prospector's camp, to the top of a low cliff and set them on the edge. They weren't building a fort. They were building an obstacle course from hell. As the first of Dryden's riders galloped forward, a well-timed shove sent a barrel of sand cascading down, not to crush, but to blind and spook. The horses reared, their riders cursing as their charge was broken by nothing more than dirt and gravity. Sheriff Briggs Harlan had no patience for this. He saw the frontal assault bogging down and decided on his own initiative. He broke from the main group with two of Corcoran's men, seeking a high game trail that would allow him to circle around and come down behind the townspeople's position. He was a hunter, and he was closing in for the kill. He rounded a sharp bend in the trail and pulled his horse up short. Standing in the path, blocking his way, was a lone figure, Tolan Flint. The young Apache warrior stood with a quiet, deadly stillness, a long hunting knife in his hand. His face was a mask of cold, focused fury. The hatred he had misdirected at Kohani had now found its rightful home. "Get out of my way, boy," Harlan snarled, reaching for his pistol. "I saw you," Tolan said, his voice low and dangerous. "In the hall. You shot at women, at children. You are a man with no honor. Honor is for men who win." Harlan spat and drew his gun. But Tolan was already moving, lunging not at Harlan, but at his horse. He slashed the reins, and the spooked animal reared, throwing the sheriff from the saddle. Harlan landed hard. The wind knocked out of him. Tolan stood over him, not with the wild rage of a berserker, but with the chilling deliberation of an executioner. His personal war had finally begun. Below, Silas Corcoran watched the chaos with a frustrated frown. His investment was literally crashing against the rocks. "Fools," he muttered, and turned to one of his hired guns. "This is taking too long. Burn them out. There's a thicket of dry manzanita upwind of their position. Set it alight. Smoke them out like rats." The man did as he was told, and soon a thick, acrid cloud of smoke began to billow from the canyon wall. But the canyon had its own moods. The wind, which had been blowing steadily down the gorge, suddenly swirled, eddying back on itself. The choking cloud of smoke did not drift toward Etta's position. It billowed back down and settled directly on top of Dryden's troopers, engulfing them in a blinding, suffocating fog. Men coughed and gagged, their eyes streaming. Horses panicked. The orderly military column dissolved into a writhing, confused mass of choking men and terrified animals. From her vantage point on a high ledge, Etta saw her chance. Through a brief clearing in the smoke, she saw Captain Dryden trying desperately to restore order. He had a small guidon, a signal flag on a short pole, and was attempting to wave it, to create a rallying point in the chaos. He was the brain of the operation. Without him, the beast would die. She raised her father's Winchester. She didn't aim for the man. She aimed for the symbol of his authority. The wind was gusting, the smoke was swirling. She took a steadying breath, just as Kohani had taught her. Stillness. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. For a moment, it seemed she had missed. Then, the rope holding the small flag to the pole snapped. The guidon, the last vestige of military order, fluttered uselessly to the ground. The signal was broken. The chain of command was severed. Dryden's force was no longer an army. It was just a mob. Dryden roared in frustration and threw the useless pole to the ground. His eyes scanned the cliffs and found her. He saw the wisp of smoke from her rifle barrel. His face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. Ignoring his men, he began to climb, his pistol in his hand. His eyes locked on Etta. She saw him coming and knew she was trapped. She fired again, but he was using the rocks for cover. She began to scramble backward along the narrow ledge, but it was a dead end, terminating at a sheer drop. He cornered her there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his uniform torn, his face black with soot and fury. "You," he hissed, leveling his pistol at her heart. "You cost me everything." Before he could fire, a shape launched itself from a higher rock. Kohani! He hit Dryden with the force of a striking hawk, knocking the pistol from his hand. It skittered across the rock and spun out into the abyss. The two men grappled, a desperate, silent struggle of pure strength and will, their bodies straining at the very edge of the world. They were locked together, a tangle of limbs and fury, turning and twisting. Their fight took them to the crumbling lip of the precipice. With a final, violent lurch, they went over. Etta screamed, lunging forward. She fell to her stomach, her hands grabbing wildly. Her fingers closed around a wrist. It was Kohani. He was dangling in the void, his entire weight held by her grip. Below him, there was nothing. Dryden was gone, swallowed by the canyon. Kohani's eyes met hers. In them, she saw a flicker of the same memory that was flashing through her own mind, a burning stable, a world of smoke and terror, and his strong arm pulling her to safety. The roles were now reversed. The debt was being repaid. His weight was immense. Her muscles screamed in protest. The rock was cutting into her arms, but she held on. "You saved me," she said, her voice a raw, strained gasp. The words pulled from a place of absolute conviction. "Now let me do it." While this life-and-death struggle played out on the cliff, the battle below reached its own climax. The townspeople, emboldened by the enemy's confusion, surged forward. They surrounded Silas Corcoran and the few men who remained with him. There was no real fight. Ivor Kett simply walked up to Corcoran, plucked him from his saddle as if he were a sack of flour, and disarmed him. Someone else grabbed the reins of Corcoran's horse and untied the saddlebags. They opened them, and a shower of official-looking documents fell to the ground. The mining claims, the fraudulent purchase offers, the secret correspondence with Captain Dryden. The papers were passed from hand to hand among the ranchers, each man reading the proof of Corcoran's treachery with his own eyes. High above, Etta pulled, gritting her teeth, every fiber of her being focused on the single task of saving the man who had saved her. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, she dragged Kohani back from the edge. He scrambled for purchase, found a foothold, and finally rolled onto the ledge beside her. both of them gasping for breath. But their ordeal was not over. Below them, on the game trail, the fight between Harlan and Tolan had concluded. Harlan lay groaning on the ground, his arm broken. As he looked up, he saw Kohani and Etta on the ledge, alive. He saw his final chance for revenge. With his good hand, he fumbled inside his coat and pulled out a small, two-shot derringer he had kept hidden. He thumbed back the hammer, his face a mask of spite, and took aim at Kohani's exposed back. He never fired the shot. Tolan Flint, stepping forward, brought the heel of his boot down hard on Harlan's wrist. The derringer fired with a pop, the bullet whining harmlessly off a rock and into the sky. The sharp, pathetic sound echoed once, twice, and then was utterly swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the canyon. The plot, the greed, the violence, it was all reduced to a final, fading whisper. The air by the Silver Thread Fork was different now. The scent of rusted iron and wet grass had replaced the smell of smoke and fear. The river flowed on, a placid, indifferent witness to the transformation of the people who had gathered on its banks. It was a scene that would have been unimaginable only days before. On one side of a makeshift council fire stood the people of Prospect Bend, the ranchers, the blacksmith, the shopkeepers. Martha Dooley with her children held close. They stood stiffly, awkwardly, their faces a mixture of shame, relief, and uncertainty. On the other side of the fire stood the people of Stone Coyote Camp. They were fewer in number, their faces etched with a deep, ancestral patience, their watchfulness born not of fear, but of a long and bitter history. Between them, the fire crackled, a fragile bridge of warmth and light across a chasm of mistrust. Deacon Weller stepped into the space between the two groups. He was no longer the timid, whispering clerk from the dusty church. He held a piece of paper in his hands, and his voice, when he spoke, was steady and clear, amplified by the solemnity of the occasion. "We, the undersigned citizens of the Prospect Bend territory," he began, his words forming a new kind of scripture for a community trying to be reborn, having been presented with undeniable proof of a criminal conspiracy, do hereby declare and resolve the following. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, ensuring every person was a witness. First, that the mining claim filed by Silas Corcoran, having been pursued through acts of violence, intimidation, and fraud, is declared null and void. All rights to the land and its mineral resources are hereby remanded to a community trust, to be administered by a council of elected representatives, for the benefit of all who live by this river. A low murmur of approval rippled through the townspeople. It was a radical act, a seizure of power from the wealthy and a return of it to the collective. Second, the deacon continued, his voice gaining strength, that Briggs Harlan is hereby stripped of his title and authority as sheriff, effective immediately. He will be held in custody and delivered to the territorial marshal to face charges of conspiracy, incitement of violence, and abuse of his office. He looked toward the back of the crowd, where Harlan sat on the ground, his broken arm in a crude sling, guarded by a grim-faced Ivor Kett. Harlan met the deacon's gaze with a look of pure, impotent venom. And third, Weller concluded, his voice ringing with a final, unshakable finality, that a formal petition be sent with the next government courier to Fort Laramie, demanding a full military court-martial of Captain Amos Dryden for his actions, and an investigation into the chain of command that allowed this conspiracy to proceed. We will have justice, and we will have accountability. He finished reading and looked out at the crowd. The resolution has been put forth. All those in favor, raise a hand. A forest of hands went up from the Prospect Bend side. Farmers, ranchers, women, even some of the men who had initially ridden with Harlan, raised their hands in a silent, collective act of reclaiming their town. Then Sachi Onyx, the elder of Stone Coyote Camp, stepped forward. He did not speak of resolutions or votes. His language was older, tied to the land itself. He looked not at the deacon, but at the river. "The white man's law is written on paper," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a profound weight. "The law of the land is written in water. This river has given life to your people and to mine. In seasons of plenty, it is generous, but in a drought, it is a miser." He turned his gaze to the assembled townspeople. "Paper can burn. A law written on water endures." He made his proposal, not as a demand, but as a statement of irrefutable logic. "We will make a new law together. When the river runs low, the water will be shared. No man's cattle will drink while another's children go thirsty. And your hunters will not pursue game into the high canyons where the she-elk give birth. And our people will not fish in the deep pools where the trout lay their eggs. We will respect the sources of life, so that life may continue for us all." It was not a treaty of surrender or victory. It was a treaty of survival. Ivor Kett, his face grim, was the first to speak from the town's side. "It is a fair offer," he rumbled. "A good one." A chorus of agreement followed. For the first time, they were not negotiating as enemies, but as neighbors with a shared future. As the new accord was being forged in words, Etta saw a lone rider approaching. It was the government courier, a weary-looking man in a dusty blue uniform on a tired horse, making his regular run to the fort. This was her chance. She would not allow the truth to be lost in transit, buried in some forgotten file cabinet. She met him as he was watering his horse, the heavy mail pouch still slung over his shoulder. "I have a package for you," she said, holding out the pouch she and Kohani had captured. "It's official military correspondence, bound for the commanding officer at Fort Laramie. And I have this." She handed him the town's newly drafted petition. "This is a petition from the citizens of Prospect Bend. It is to be delivered with the pouch. They are to be opened together." The courier looked from the pouch to the petition, then to the strange gathering on the riverbank. He was a man who knew better than to ask too many questions. He could smell the tension in the air, the scent of a story far more complex than his job required him to understand. "And I'll need a receipt," Etta added, her tone leaving no room for argument. She handed him a piece of paper and a pencil. "A signed receipt, acknowledging that you have taken possession of 1 military mail pouch and 1 citizen's petition, to be delivered directly to the commander's office." He looked at her, a flicker of respect in his tired eyes, and signed the paper. She had learned the white man's game well. A signature on a piece of paper could be as powerful as a bullet. As the courier rode off, becoming a small dot on the horizon, Kohani came to stand beside her. They watched the dust of the rider settle. "The truth is on its way," she said, a wave of exhaustion and relief washing over her. "Paper travels slowly," he observed, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains, "and words can be twisted." He turned to her, his expression serious. The truth must echo longer than a gunshot. Etta met his gaze, a fierce new determination hardening her own. "Then we will be the echo," she replied. A movement from the crowd drew their attention. It was Martha Dooley. She walked hesitantly across the space between the two groups and stopped before Kohani. She looked at this man who had been branded a monster, this man her neighbors had wanted to see hang, and her face was filled with a profound and difficult shame. "On behalf of this town," Martha began, her voice thick with emotion, "and on behalf of every person who is too scared or too ignorant to see the truth, I want to apologize. The words we used, the hatred we allowed to grow in our hearts, it was wrong. You saved one of our own, and we called you a criminal. I am deeply sorry." Kohani did not reply immediately. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes holding a deep well of history and pain. Then he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement. It was a start. Then another figure stepped forward. It was Tolan Flint. He walked not to Kohani, but to Sachi Onyx, in his hand. He held the small, intricately beaded medallion that marked him as one of the camp's lead scouts. He held it out to the elder. "My anger made me blind," he said, his voice low and steady, For all to hear, I saw only the ghosts of the past, and I almost betrayed our future." He looked across the fire at Kohani, then at Edda. "I will ride with the courier. I will go to the fort. I will tell them what I saw Sheriff Harlan do. I will be a witness against him." He placed the medallion in the elder's hand, a willing surrender of his status. It was his penance, his first step on the long road to restoring his own honor. The day's business was concluding. The reckoning had come. Silas Corcoran, his face a mask of disbelief that his money could not save him, was tied to a horse, to be led to the nearest territorial jail. Harlan was beside him, his snarled curses ignored by everyone. Their reign was over. The wind that blew down from the mountains no longer carried the scent of their greed. Only the clean, sharp smell of pine and the promise of rain. And then, a new sound began to cut through the quiet. Serious atmosphere. It was the sound of laughter. On the flat, calm stretch of the river, a small group of children had gathered. There were 2 of Martha Dooley's boys and 3 young children from Stone Coyote Camp, unburdened by the bitter history of their parents. They had found a common language that required no words. They were skipping stones. A small Apache girl with bright, curious eyes found a perfectly flat, smooth stone. She flicked her wrist with an expert snap, and the stone danced across the water's surface. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times before sinking. One of Martha's sons let out an appreciative whoop and immediately began searching for a stone of his own, determined to beat her score. They weren't white children and native children. They were just children, engaged in the timeless, universal contest of making a rock dance on water. A few of the adults, both from the town and the camp, watched them, and hesitant. Fragile smiles began to appear on their faces. It was a glimpse of a different kind of future, a future where the river was not a border, but a playground. Edda stood beside Kohani, watching the children, listening to their easy laughter, the weight of the past few weeks, the fire, the fear, the fight. It was all still there, a heavy cloak upon her shoulders. But for the first time, it felt as though she might one day be able to set it down. She looked at the river, then at the man standing beside her. The braided leather thong on her wrist was a comfortable, familiar weight. "We're not finished," she said softly, speaking as much to herself as to him. The legal battles, the rebuilding, the slow, difficult process of turning a truce into a true peace, it all lay ahead of them, a mountain range of uncertainty. He didn't look at her, but she knew he was listening. His gaze was on the river, on the 2 groups of people who were now beginning to mingle, to speak in low, cautious tones. "No," he agreed. "We are not finished." He paused, then added, "But today, we stand on the same shore." The sunset poured liquid copper over Prospect Bend, healing the bruised and battered landscape with a soft, forgiving light. The great, violent acts were done. The shouts had faded. The gunshots had been swallowed by the canyons, and what remained was a quiet, fragile stillness. Down by the river, where the water ran clear and cool over smooth stones, a small circle of people had formed. There was no church roof, no courthouse walls. The only witnesses were the vast, silent sky and the river that had seen everything. In the center of the circle stood Edda and Kohani. Between them, on a flat, moss-covered rock, sat a single, unadorned clay bowl. Sachi Onyx stood on one side of them, his presence as ancient and rooted as the mountains at his back. On the other side stood Deacon Weller, his prayer book held closed in his hands, his role not to preach his own faith, but to bear witness to the birth of a new one. The 2 traditions did not clash. They stood in quiet, respectful observance of one another. 2 different sets of eyes seeing the same truth. Sachi Onyx was the first to act. He lifted the clay bowl, which was filled with cool, clear water from the silver thread fork. He held it before Edda. There were no grand pronouncements, no solemn incantations. The ritual was in the act itself, simple and profound. Etta took the bowl in both hands. She remembered the first time he had given her water, in the desert, when he had commanded her to take small sips. This time, her hands did not tremble. She looked at Kohani over the rim of the bowl, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. She drank, just a small sip, a taste of the life and the future they were about to share. She then passed the bowl to Kohani. He took it, his eyes never leaving hers. He raised the bowl to his lips and drank the rest, a long, deep draught that accepted the life she had offered. When the bowl was empty, he did not set it down. He tilted it, allowing the last few clinging drops of water to fall onto a single, glowing coal that had been placed on the rock. The water met the fire with a soft hiss, and for a fleeting moment, a wisp of steam rose into the evening air, smoke and water, fire and river, his story and hers, becoming one before vanishing into the twilight. It was a union blessed by the elements that had defined their journey. Now it was Kohani's turn to give. He took from his wrist a new braided cord. It was a beautiful, intricate thing. He had woven it himself from the softest, strongest strips of deer hide. But intertwined with the dark leather were the pale, tough fibers of the yucca plant. It was the same fiber the women of Stone Coyote Camp, the women who had taken her in, had taught Etta how to make. It was his strength, interwoven with her newfound community, her newfound skills. He took her hand, the one that had held him from the edge of the abyss, and gently tied the cord around her wrist, beside the simple protective band he had given her in the cave. It settled there, a perfect, seamless fit. Then it was Etta's turn. From a pocket in her dress, she took a small, tightly woven bracelet. After the battle in the canyon, she had found her buckskin mare, the one Kohani had freed from the stable, grazing peacefully. She had taken a small lock of the horse's long, thick mane, a piece of the life she had saved from the fire, and spent the afternoon braiding it into a strong, resilient circle. It was a piece of her past, a symbol of her resilience, a promise of her enduring strength. She took Kohani's hand, his strong, calloused fingers wrapping around her own. She slipped the bracelet of horsehair over his wrist. It was her history, now bound to his. They stood, hands joined, their new bonds visible for all to see. They did not recite long, memorized vows. Their promises were forged from their shared experience, spoken with a simplicity that made them unbreakable. "You saved me from the fire," Etta said, her voice soft but clear as the river water. "You saved me from the silence," Kohani answered, his voice a low, steady echo. They looked at each other, then out at the two communities, now one circle, standing before them. Together, they spoke the final vow, a promise made not just to each other, but to the future. "And together, we will save tomorrow." A profound stillness settled over the riverbank. Then, Sachi Onyx bent down and picked up a small, smooth stone from the water's edge. He walked forward and placed it carefully on the flat rock where the bowl had rested. It was the foundation. Deacon Weller, understanding the gesture, did the same, placing his own stone beside the elders. Then, one by one, the others came forward. Martha Dooley, her face streaked with tears of a grief finally laid to rest, placed a stone for the husband she had lost and the future her children would now have. Ivor Kett, the blacksmith, added a heavy piece of river iron, strong and dependable as himself, an Apache woman, one who had shown Etta which roots to gather for medicine, added a small, white piece of quartz that gleamed in the fading light. Each person came, from both sides of the now vanished divide, and added their own small stone to the growing pile. It was not a wall to keep people out. It was a cairn, a landmark of reconciliation, a monument to a new boundary not of land, but of trust, built by the hands of everyone. As the last stone was placed, the air changed. A gentle breeze sighed down from the high country, carrying with it the cool, clean scent of rain on dry pine needles. The first drops began to fall, not a violent deluge like the storm in the canyon, but a soft, baptizing summer shower. The drops spattered on the stones of the cairn, making them dark and slick, sealing the monument with the blessing of the sky. The small crowd began to disperse, seeking the shelter of their homes and lodges, leaving the couple in the gentle rain. Kohani took off the heavy wool cloak he wore and draped it over both their shoulders. They stood huddled together in their own small world of warmth and shelter, the rain whispering around them. He looked down at her, the last of the sunset glowing in her eyes. He lowered his head, and she raised hers to meet him. Their first kiss was not a thing of fire and passion. It was as gentle and as life-giving as the rain that fell around them. It was a quiet confirmation, a final seal on the unspoken promises that had passed between them in the dark of a cave and the light of a new day. It tasted of rain and wood smoke, of resilience and of peace. It was light, long, and held the warmth of a home finally, truly found. As they stood there, wrapped in a single cloak, a new sound drifted down from the town. It was a rhythmic, metallic ringing, the sound of a hammer on iron. In the twilight, Ivor Kett, his work never truly done, had taken down the offensive sign from the town's message board. He was not destroying it, he was reforging it. The sound they heard was the sound of change being hammered into permanence. He was painstakingly altering the words, changing the sign that had once read land clearance into a new proclamation for a new era shared water crossing. Edda heard the sound, and a slow, deep smile spread across her face. She leaned her forehead against Kohani's, the gesture as familiar and as comforting as breathing. She looked into his eyes and saw her own hope reflected there. "You saved me," she whispered, the words a perfect, contented echo of their journey. "Now do it." He understood her meaning completely. It was no longer a desperate command to survive the night. It was a joyful plea to begin a life. He gathered her closer under the cloak, his voice a soft, unbreakable promise against her skin. "I will," he answered. "Every morning, every season." The imaginary camera of the storyteller's mind pulls back. It lifts away from the two figures huddled under a single cloak, their quiet laughter mingling with the soft hiss of the rain. It drifts over the newly built cairn of stones, a dark, solid shape on the riverbank. It floats over the silver thread fork, its surface shimmering in the last of the twilight, a ribbon of life connecting two communities as one. From the town, a few lights begin to twinkle, and a thin, gentle stream of smoke rises from a cooking fire in the camp. The sound of the hammer fades, replaced by the gentle murmur of the river. The story does not end. It simply flows into the quiet, hopeful beginning of a long and peaceful tomorrow. Thank you for listening to this story. I truly hope you enjoyed the journey of Edda and Kohani. Let me know where in the world you're listening from in the comments below. I love seeing how far these tales travel and sharing in your thoughts. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, please consider subscribing to the channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you really want to support the channel, hitting that hype button helps this story reach more listeners just like you. Thank you again.